Well, thanks, Megan, for the introduction and for the invitation to give a talk. This is the first time I've ever given a webinar, so I'm very eager to try out the technology, and we'll ask you to bear with me if there are any hiccups. And also, thanks very much to Megan for dialing in at 3 a.m. in Australia. So she's operating in the middle of the night here. As Megan said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that I've been doing looking at mantle dynamics and patterns of mantle flow beneath the high lava plains in Oregon, using data both from the transportable array and also from a temporary deployment in the HLP. Before I go on, I do want to just emphasize that a lot of people have contributed to the work that I'm going to be talking about, and there's a list here of folks who are co-authors and collaborators on various pieces of the work that I'm going to be talking about. So I'd like to start and kind of motivate the talk by showing this figure that shows recent volcanism in the western U.S. So this is volcanism that is younger than about 17 million years or so. So the figure was put together by Rick Carlson after Ludke and Smith, 1984. The first very striking thing that jumps out at you looking at a map like this, of course, is that there has been a great deal of volcanism, a great deal of volcanic activity over the last 17 million years or so throughout the western U.S. Some features of this map are fairly well understood. Of course, we see the Cascades volcanic chain here. It's pretty well understood as being a result of Juan de Fuca's subduction beneath North America. And then there are a lot of features that are a little less well understood, but very prominent on this map. So first of all, you can see the large area of Columbia River and Steens basalt that began erupting around 17 million years ago. And then on top of that, and a bit to the south and to the east here, there are two fairly large and well-defined spatiotemporal trends of volcanic activity. One is the Yellowstone Snake River Plain chain here a little bit to the east, which sort of trends younger and younger, particularly in the rhyolitic volcanism leading up to the Yellowstone caldera here. And then there's, to the west of that, there's kind of almost a mirror image, fairly well-defined spatiotemporal trend, at least in the rhyolitic volcanism, here in the high lava plains region of eastern Oregon. So, as I said, some aspects of this are fairly well understood, particularly the volcanic chain here to the west, but we really would like to have an explanation, particularly for what's going on in the mantle that has caused all of this volcanic activity over the last 17 million years. And a big question is what is the origin of and interaction between the Columbia River and Steens flood basalt and then the subsequent volcanic activity in the high lava plains and the Snake River Plain. Just to focus in a bit more on the HLP and its characteristics, this map shows a bunch of things. Here in brown, this is the extent of the Columbia River and Steens basalt flows. This is the strontium 706 line, which basically marks the boundary of Tectonic North America here to the east. The thick black contours mark, these are age contours for the rhyolitic volcanism, rhyolitic volcanic activity here in the eastern Snake River Plain and here in the high lava plains. And you can see in the Yellowstone Snake River Plain trend, there's a fairly well-defined age progression where the rhyolitic volcanism gets younger and younger as you go up to Yellowstone here to the northeast. And this roughly parallels the direction of the absolute motion of the North American plate. So this has been fairly well understood, or it's often interpreted as the expression of the motion of the North American plate over some kind of hotspot or mantle melting anomaly. It's also worth noting that in addition to the rhyolitic volcanism, there's widespread young basaltic volcanic activity in the Yellowstone Snake River Plain. Over here, a little bit to the west, is the high lava plains track, which also has a fairly well-defined spatiotemporal trend, at least in the rhyolitic volcanism, which kind of culminates in Newberry Volcano, which is right here. Of course, this track is oblique to plate motion, so it's a little less obvious why this age progression should be there. And it's also worth noting that in the HLP, as in the Snake River Plain, there's widespread young basalt flows kind of throughout the region. So this really is, has been a bit of a puzzle why, why the high lava plains volcanics are there, and what are the relationships between HLP volcanism and the earlier Columbia River and Steens basalts, as well as the Yellowstone Snake River Plain trend off to the east. So there have been a bunch of different models that have been proposed to explain the origin and evolution of the high lava plains. This is really just a sampling. It has been suggested that the melting might be triggered by kind of asthenospheric inflow due to the rollback and steepening of the Cascadia slab. Kind of a fairly closely related model was suggested last year by Fucena and others, what they called subduction-triggered magmatic pulses. Basically, you get decompression melting associated with subduction return flow. It's also been suggested that maybe the high lava plains is really sort of associated with the Yellowstone plume tail, that the plume tail might actually be driving mantle flow parallel to the strike of the HLP trend. Extension in the overriding lithosphere has been proposed as a potential way to get volcanic activity, and perhaps related to extension in the basin and range to the south. It's also been suggested that maybe you have kind of topography on the base of the lithosphere that may play a role in guiding asthenospheric material kind of along the track of the HLP. So, some or maybe any or maybe a combination of these models, might be able to explain the origin and evolution of the high lava plains. We've had some difficulty discriminating among them using the available data. So the key question that I'm going to kind of address today is what is the nature of mantle dynamics beneath the HLP today and also over the past 17 million years or so, and how does mantle flow and mantle processes relate to the volcanism that we see at the surface? In order to address these questions, I've been involved with the High Lava Plains project. This is a big interdisciplinary project that's just wrapping up. It was funded by the Continental Dynamics program at NSF, designed to study the origin and evolution of the HLP. It involved a big group of people, including folks in the geochemistry, geology, petrology side, and as well as geophysics. And in this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on results from the broadband seismology and geodynamical modeling facets of the project. I got involved in the project as a postdoc at DTM working with David James. So the broadband seismic experiment component of the project consisted of over 100 broadbands that were deployed in the high lava plains and the surrounding region. Most of the instruments were deployed for a little over 2 years, between spring 2007 and fall 2009, and a few of them were moved, so almost 120 total sites were occupied. And so when you combine this high lava plains broadband data set with the transportable array stations in the area shown in green, and also stations of the Wallowa Mountains array to the north, which was run by Gene Humphreys, we really have an amazing and very detailed data set with which to look at some of these upper mantle processes and tie them to the volcanism that we see at the surface. So that's the data. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the tool that I'm mainly going to use in this talk to look at mantle flow, and that's observations and models of seismic anisotropy in the upper mantle. I know this is a fairly familiar concept to many people, but just to quickly go through it, the idea is that you have mantle flow, which gives you deformation, and at least under certain conditions, when you take an aggregate of olivine and deform it, you get a lattice preferred orientation, an LPO. And that results in seismic anisotropy on kind of a macroscopic scale that's relevant for seismic waves. So the idea is that you have some kind of horizontal mantle flow beneath a station. This is kind of an example scenario. And at least for most types of olivine fabric, A, C, or E type, that will result in seismic anisotropy that has a fast direction that's roughly parallel to the direction of mantle flow. That's if you have horizontal mantle flow with a vertical gradient in the mantle flow velocity. There is kind of an exception to this rule of thumb in the case of B-type olivine fabric, which you can get if you have high amounts of water, high stresses, and low temperatures. That can change by 90 degrees this relationship. For the high lava plain setting, we're quite sure that A, C, or E-type fabric is probably relevant, so this rule of thumb holds. And the idea looking at shear wave splitting, which is one of the observables that I'm going to talk about, the idea is you have an incident shear wave that has some kind of initial linear polarization. It's traveling nearly vertically through the upper mantle beneath the station. It hits the anisotropic volume, and it's split into fast and slow components. So the direction of the fast polarization is telling you something about the geometry of the anisotropy, and in turn about the direction of mantle flow. And then the time delay between fast and slow is telling you something about the strength of anisotropy. So as I said, this rule of thumb that you can go to a seismic station, measure the fast splitting direction, and that is probably more or less telling you about the direction of horizontal mantle flow, is it's not true everywhere in the Earth, everywhere in the mantle, but we think it's probably true for this region. So to come back to the idea of understanding mantle flow beneath the high lava plains, if we want to start to kind of discriminate among all of those different models I talked about that have been proposed for HLP formation, one of the things that we can look at is the fact that they make different predictions about the present day pattern of mantle flow beneath the region. So the idea behind the work I'm going to talk about is to ask, can we use shear wave splitting measurements and also other indicators of anisotropy, which I'll talk about later in the talk, and can this give us insight into the formation and evolution of the HLP, and in particular, what are the links between upper mantle dynamics and upper mantle processes and the tectonomagmatic activity that we see at the surface. So what I'm going to talk about quickly is the character of this shear wave splitting data set that we've put together for the high lava plains broadband stations, the TA stations, which are shown here as the green squares, and also the stations of the Wallowa Mountain experiment, which together, it's over 200 broadband stations covering eastern Oregon, really a terrific combined data set. So I'm going to be talking about a version of the shear wave splitting data set that we published a couple of years ago. It's been updated since then, and we're currently working on combining this with some surface wave constraints to produce a new model of upper mantle anisotropy. The version of the data set I'm going to show here contains about 3,000 very high quality measurements of SKS splitting from teleseismic events. This is a map of the event distribution. Before I start showing splitting maps, I do want to show one really nice example of SKS splitting. And I picked this one because it looks particularly nice, but it's actually not atypical. There are a lot of arrivals in the data set that look like this. So what's being shown here up in the upper left, this is the raw uncorrected waveform. So the blue dashed line is the radial component, and then the red line is the transverse component. You can see there's very strong transverse component energy here, which is strongly indicative of shear wave splitting and anisotropy. We use two different splitting measurement methods, the rotation correlation method and the Silver and Chan transverse component minimization method, to try to measure these splitting parameters. This is just a really nice example. Here, what's being shown in these panels, these are the corrected waveforms, so you can see that the energy on the transverse component has been almost completely removed. Here's the uncorrected particle motion, which is strongly elliptical, and the corrected particle motion. And both methods yield the same set of splitting parameters, a fast direction of 64 degrees and a delay time of 2.4 seconds. So this is a really nice, beautiful, clean example of SKS splitting. It's also very strong. I mean, a delay time of 2.4 seconds is pretty big. But a lot of the arrivals in the data set look like this. It's really an example of a data set that has very beautiful, clear, kind of unmistakable SKS splitting with very well-constrained splitting parameters. So that's something to keep in mind as we look at these maps. For those of us who look at SKS splitting, have looked at a lot of data sets, you don't often see beautiful arrivals that look like this and have such nice, well-constrained splitting parameters. So now let's look at the data set in map view. So this is what's being shown here. These are the highest quality individual splitting measurements at each station. On the left, these are the non-null measurements, and then on the right, these are the null measurements. So these are arrivals that don't show any splitting. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a flavor for the data set. Over here on the left, a couple of things I'd like to emphasize. First of all, especially down here in the high lava plains, proper, we see really nice, pretty consistent, well-behaved fast directions that are roughly east-west. You look up a little bit to the north, particularly north of about 45 degrees or so, and we see a lot more complexity in the splitting pattern. This actually is really visible when you look at the nulls. Again, stations in the northern third of our study area have a lot more null arrivals. There's the null, the back azimuths at which you see null splitting are much more spread out. But here in the high lava plains itself, these null measurements are plotted with one as a cross with one arm parallel to the back azimuth of the arrival and the other perpendicular to it. And you can see that these align very well with this, what you would expect for this east-west fast direction that we see in the non-null measurements. So the first thing I want you to take away here is that there's kind of a first-order difference between the northern part of our study area where the splitting measurements are fairly complex and the high lava plains proper where we really see very nice, well-behaved splitting patterns that are pretty simple. This really shows up very nicely when we look at splitting patterns at individual stations, and this is just a couple of examples from two TA stations. On the left is Geo 5A, so this is a station in the northern part of the study area. And here there's a very striking dependence of the measured splitting parameters on back azimuth, so that's very strongly indicative of complex anisotropic structure at depth. Very likely multiple layers of anisotropy. We think that there's probably a strong contribution from the lithosphere as well as the asthenosphere here that's giving us a complicated pattern. In contrast, over here on the right, this is the pattern at JO6A, and this is a really very simple, nice, well-behaved splitting pattern. We have well-constrained splitting measurements from 3 different back azimuthal quadrants, and then a cluster of null measurements, which are right where you would expect to see them with this kind of fast direction. And this is very typical of stations that are located kind of within the HLP itself, where they tend to have very simple, well-constrained splitting patterns that are really consistent with a single layer of basically horizontal anisotropy. So we don't see much evidence for kind of complicated anisotropic structure at stations right within the HLP. Okay, so now I'd like to put up this figure. This is just a map of the single station average splitting parameters for all the stations that we looked at. Again, some first order characteristics. Within the HLP itself, there's very consistent splitting with basically an east-west fast direction, very large delay time. So at single stations, the averages are up to about 2.5 seconds, and individual measurements go up to about 3 seconds. As I said, everything north of about 45 degrees is much more complex, so I would certainly take these average fast directions kind of with a grain of salt here. So we're averaging very complicated patterns. But within the HLP itself, the splitting is quite well behaved, and these average splitting parameters are very robust. Another feature I'd like you to notice here is that within kind of the HLP itself, we see some really intriguing spatial variations in delay time. So the fast directions are pretty coherent throughout the study region, but we have a region right here within the heart of the high lava plains that tend to have very large delay times, up to 2.5 seconds as a single station average. You go a little bit outside of that, and there's this group of stations shown in yellow that have averages above 1.7 seconds, and then you go particularly up a little bit to the northwest along the HLP track. There's a group of stations that tend to have somewhat lower delay times, and then there's a group of stations here just to the north of Newberry Volcano that again have these large delay times. So the fast directions look very, very coherent throughout the region, but we see some very intriguing spatial variations in delay times, and I'm going to come back to that towards the end of the talk. I just want to make the point again that these delay times are quite large compared to other regions in the world. The average delay time for SKS splitting for continental regions is about 1 second. In our Eastern Oregon data set, it's about 1.8 seconds, and within the high lava plains proper, it's even higher, about 2.2 seconds. These large delay times really argue for a significant contribution to splitting from anisotropy in the asthenosphere, kind of due to active contemporary mantle flow. It's hard to put 2 or 2.5 seconds of splitting in the lithosphere and attribute it to frozen-in anisotropic structure. that's particularly true because we think that the lithosphere beneath the HLP is thin. There may not be much mantle lithosphere there at all. So these large delay times really argue very strongly that we're mainly seeing a signal from active mantle flow in the asthenospheric mantle. So if we think about what these fast directions mean, the first thing we can do is kind of compare them to some other indicators of plate motions and tectonic processes. These dominant, basically east-west fast directions in the HLP, they're not parallel to either the absolute plate motion of the North American plate or to the relative motion of the Juan de Fuca plate. Those are basically parallel. They're also not parallel to the strike of the HLP volcanic trend, which kind of gets younger as you go up, to the northwest here. They are parallel to the direction of trench rollback. So the Juan de Fuca trench is retreating at about 30 millimeters a year, and these are parallel to that direction of trench rollback. So we can think about what's the geodynamic interpretation of these fast directions. As I said, they're not parallel to the strike of the HLP trend, and this, I think, really does rule out the idea that present-day mantle flow is along the strike of the HLP trend, as suggested by some of these Plume-driven models. We do see very strong azimuthal anisotropy in the upper mantle, which is manifested in these large delay times, which I think argues against significant present-day upwelling or vertical flow beneath the HLP. We think we see strong horizontal flow. Of course, this doesn't mean that there hasn't been upwelling there in the past, but at least the contemporary flow field, looks like it's probably mostly horizontal. As I said, the fast directions are parallel to the direction of trench rollback for the Cascadia subduction zone. So we can kind of hypothesize that rollback is inducing this kind of large-scale toroidal upper mantle flow that gives you dominantly east-west flow beneath the high lava plains and the Cascadia back arc. And of course, this is a question that can be tested using geodynamical modeling. So I'm going to spend a few slides talking about some models that have been run by Kelsey Drukin and Chris Kincaid at URI. This is a photograph of their lab setup. They actually were using the lab setup at the Australian National University. So it's basically a big tank of corn syrup, which kind of simulates the ambient mantle. And then there's this big, kinematic slab that can be shoved down, mimicking subduction into the tank of mantle. And they have a really neat setup where they can change the down dip motion of the slab. They can change the motion of the trench, mimicking slab rollback. They can change the dip of the slab throughout the experiment. So they're really able to look at a bunch of different parameters that describe subduction and see what that does to flow patterns in the mantle wedge. So I'm showing this movie. I hope it shows up on everybody's computer, but this hopefully gives you an idea of what these models actually look like. This is just looping over and over again, so I'm just going to let it run. This is an example of one of Kelsey's experiments where she has a slab going down, and a few seconds into the movie, very quickly, first you have the down dip motion of the slab, and then rollback kicks in. So you have trench migration in this experiment. Now the camera is staying in the frame of the slab, so the camera is kind of following the trench as it migrates. But you can see that once you kick on trench migration, you kind of have this a change in the flow field. And then here we have this overriding plate, and you can maybe see that there's this mylar reel is mimicking extension in the overriding plate. Now, velocities within the fluid are tracked using these bubbles, and there are also little beads in the flow that allow for us to track the velocities. And in these experiments where we were looking at, where Kelsey was looking at anisotropy development, she also seeded the fluid with these whiskers that locally align with the finite strain field. So that's what's giving us the indication of what we would expect the anisotropy patterns to be for these types of models. So this is a series of experiments that Kelsey ran specifically to look at anisotropy beneath the HLP. So this is just a schematic diagram of that lab setup. You saw a picture of it a couple slides ago. The way we look at these whiskers is there's actually a light sheet that is illuminating basically a horizontal plane at a depth that corresponds to about 200 kilometers in the mantle, and then we're looking at the horizontal alignment of these paintbrush whiskers in the fluid. So Kelsey has run a bunch of different models here, and what's different, all of these have the same down dip motion of the slab. That's what's in this column here. Many of them have a component of trench rollback, so this is mimicking the rollback of the Cascadia Trench at about 30 millimeters a year. And then some of them also have extension on the overriding plate, and some of them have a variable dip of the slab. And what Kelsey did is she ran each of these twice with a different initial alignment of the whiskers. So for one of these experiments, all the whiskers were basically aligned parallel to the trench, and then in the other run, they were all aligned perpendicular to the trench. So this is basically allowing her to look at the two end-member cases for initial alignment. And then here in the table, what's being shown is the final amount of alignment parallel and perpendicular to the trench in the part of the system that we're looking at, which corresponds to the high lava plains. So this is just a photograph of one of the experimental runs, which hopefully gives you an idea of what the geometry looks like from above. Here's the trench here, so the trench is rolling back to the left here, and there's down dip motion to the right. These gray lines correspond basically to the horizontal streamlines that are associated with this flow field. The blue box is the region that corresponds to the HLP, and then hopefully you can see these whiskers, which are aligning as indicators of the finite strain. So the question we're asking in this series of experiments is, what are the effects of the competing effects of slab rollback, upper plate extension, down dip motion, and changing slab dip on the finite strain alignment that we would expect to see in the far back arc part of the mantle wedge. So these are some of Kelsey's experimental results. What's being shown here on the left, the top panel, these are for experiments that only have a down dip component of motion, so just basic down dip subduction. So in experiment 32, in the black one, these were cases where most of the whiskers were initially aligned normal to the trench. The blue case, these are ones that were initially aligned parallel to the trench. And what's being shown here is that when you only have down dip motion and you're trying to realign whiskers that were initially trench parallel, down dip motion does not do a very good job of doing this. So in the end, you end up with only about less than half of your whiskers aligned parallel to the plate motion and perpendicular to the trench. However, for the set of experiments where there's a significant component of trench rollback, now the flow field does a much better job of aligning those whiskers in the far back arc to a trench normal direction. So here, even for the case where you started out with all of your whiskers parallel to the trench, by the end of the experiment, 75% of them are aligned in this trench normal direction. So what this really demonstrates is that it's the cases with slab rollback that do a much better and more efficient job of getting this trench normal, what would be basically east-west alignment in the far back arc, which is relevant for thinking about the HLP data set. This also shows up when you look at this kind of time-dependent view. This is a set of experiments where, again, that initial orientation of the whiskers was parallel to the trench, and so basically the flow field is trying to realign them. So two of these experiments, the green and blue ones, have rollback, and then the black one doesn't. And you can see this is time, normalized laboratory time, and then millions of years. So you can see that she runs the experiment for a while, and then in these two experiments, the blue and the green, she kicks in the rollback, and after you kick in rollback, these experiments do a much better and more efficient job of realigning these finite strain markers. So the bottom line here is that experiments that include rollback tend to produce trench normal alignment in the far back arc much better and more efficiently than experiments that don't have rollback. And that's even if the initial alignment of the whiskers is 90 degrees away from where they end up. The other point I'd like to make just before I move on is that this whisker alignment is very time dependent, and it turns out that in Kelsey's experiments, she needs pretty long model runs, which correspond to about 60 or 70 million years, that are needed to efficiently realign the fabric. So what we did is we compared these whisker orientations from Kelsey's kind of most HLP-like experiment, which had rollback and extension of the upper plate, and compared them to the SKS splitting data set for the HLP region, and we see a very good match between the observations and the model. So we think we can say with some confidence that the upper mantle flow beneath the HLP appears to be controlled by the rollback of the Cascadia slab. And one thing that I'll just say in passing, I don't have any results from these experiments in the talk, but Kelsey and Chris have also been running experiments that include a plume, so include hot buoyant material coming up from the bottom of the tank. And what they found is that in these plume experiments, the plume material really acts as a passive tracer. So the plume is not controlling the flow field. Instead, it kind of gets caught up in this subduction-induced or subduction-controlled flow field. So if you think of it as a competition between the subduction-induced flow and the flow you would expect from a buoyant plume kind of impinging on a plate above it, the subduction-induced flow always wins. So what they found is that in their models, even if there is plume material, the plume is not what's controlling the flow field. Instead, the plume stuff kind of gets swept into the subduction-induced flow as kind of a passive tracer. So to come back to a big important question, is there a plume involved in HLP volcanism? The view from seismic anisotropy, I think, would answer that question with a resounding maybe. What we can say, I think, with some certainty is that the flow field beneath the HLP, really appears to be controlled by subduction processes. It's controlled, mainly by the rollback of the Cascadia slab and not by a plume. So if we look at, this is a figure from this paper by Camp and Ross, 2004, where they're proposing this, kind of plume head origin for the high lava plains trend. They're kind of invoking flow of this plume material that's kind of, pushing flow along the strike of the HLP trend. And the anisotropy observations and the models, I think, really are arguing against this scenario. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily arguing against the presence of plume material, but from the models that Chris and Kelsey have run, I think we can say that if plume material is present beneath the HLP, it acts as a passive tracer that's going to get swept up in this subduction-induced flow field, and it's not driving the flow field itself. So I can say a plume is certainly not required by the anisotropy data. I don't think that the presence of plume material can be ruled out necessarily either, but we can say with some certainty that the flow field really appears to be controlled by subduction. So I'd like to, just in the last few minutes here, come back to this question of these unusually high delay times in the HLP. And I'd like to motivate this part of the talk by showing this. This is a figure put together by Matt Fouch based on his compilation of shear wave splitting measurements in the western U.S., mainly from TA data, but also from various temporary experiments. So this isn't a tomography model. The colors here correspond to average shear wave splitting delay times. And if you just glance at this map, it turns out that even though the whole western U.S. has fairly high delay times compared to a lot of continental regions, one of the most striking features on this map is the high lava plains. I mean, this stands out as a region that has, consistently high delay times, and again, we have a very high quality data set that lets us be very confident that this is a real feature. So the HLP is really, along with a few other features such as the San Andreas and then this low, the Nevada, so-called Nevada anomaly. And this is one of the features that really jumps out at you when you look at a map of shear wave splitting throughout the western U.S. And so we'd really like to be able to explain, well, why does the high lava plains have such, such large delay times? As I've said, it likely does reflect particularly strong and coherent horizontal upper mantle flow. But in addition to just explaining the large delay times, we also want to explain these spatial variations that we see, where we have delay times of up to 2.5 seconds right in the heart of the HLP, and then you go a little outside, and they drop off to maybe 1 second to 1.5 seconds. So there are a few ideas. I mean, this could reflect differences in the strength of Olivine LPO, maybe dependent on temperature or volatile content. Maybe it's the thickness of the anisotropic layer. An intriguing possibility is that we're looking at melt-related shape-preferred orientation. Perhaps there's a contribution from crustal anisotropy or frozen anisotropy in the lithosphere, or maybe it's a combination. So I'm going to kind of go through each of these possibilities in a little bit of detail. Before I get to that, I want to just bring in some constraints from a few other types of models which might help to shed light on this. One thing that we've been looking at is comparing these shear wave splitting delay times, so the strength of anisotropy, to other types of data such as isotropic wave speeds. So it's being shown here on the left. This is a comparison between our shear wave splitting data set and an isotropic P-wave velocity model. This is the model of Roth et al. From 2008. This is a depth slice at 100 kilometers. And at first glance, I mean, there's maybe a first-order correlation where, up here, beneath the Blue Mountain region where we tend to see somewhat lower delay times, there's maybe some relatively faster velocities. But that correlation kind of breaks down if you look at the HLP itself. The region right in the middle of the HLP that has particularly large delay times is actually associated with relatively fast wave speeds. So there's maybe a hint of a first-order correlation with the isotropic P wave speeds, but that kind of breaks down if you look at the details. The same is true if you look at an isotropic S wave speed model. So this is a Rayleigh wave derived model from Wagner and others from last year. And again, she sees relatively slow isotropic velocities beneath the high lava plains, which is where we see these enhanced large delay times. But again, if you look in detail, that correlation doesn't completely hold up. This is a figure from Laura's paper where she was comparing the surface expression in these rhyolites to the isotropic S wave speed velocities as well as the shear wave splitting. So it's being shown in red. This is a 3% velocity, slow velocity perturbation from the reference model. And then the grayscale is, these symbols are the shear wave splitting, and then the triangles are the rhyolites. And again, the region that has some of these really high delay times, doesn't obviously correlate with the boundaries of this 3% velocity contour. There's a somewhat better correlation. She's drawn in here this 7 million year old age contour. So the rhyolites older than that are here off to the east, and younger than that are off to the west. And this 7 million year old age contour does kind of correspond to this fairly sharp drop-off in shear wave splitting delay times up here to the northwest. So there is kind of an interesting hint of a correlation between the age of the rhyolites and the larger delay times, but the correlation with just the isotropic wave speeds isn't great. Another kind of piece of information that we can bring in as we start to think about these spatial variations and delay times is some depth constraints on anisotropy. Of course, SKS splitting gives you, notoriously poor depth constraints because it's a path-integrated measurement, but there are other seismological observables that can tell you a little bit about the depth distribution of azimuthal anisotropy. Over on the left, this is a figure from a paper by Lin et al., where they're using ambient noise and also event-based surface wave observations, combining them with SKS and coming up for a depth-dependent model of azimuthal anisotropy. They do see, pretty strong east-west fast directions, with fairly strong anisotropy beneath the HLP. They don't really see evidence for spatial variations in that, in the strength of that anisotropy, at least in the uppermost mantle. This is a slice through their model at 50 kilometers. Another type of data that is sensitive really only to the uppermost mantle, the very uppermost mantle is PN data, and this is a PN tomographic model by Buehler and Shear that includes azimuthal anisotropy. And if you look just at what's happening at the very uppermost mantle, they actually don't see particularly strong anisotropy beneath, just that uppermost mantle beneath the HLP, which is maybe, an argument that the strength, that strong anisotropy that's giving us these spatial variations, might be distributed throughout a greater depth range of the upper mantle. I'll also just say in passing, I don't have any data of this from this in the talk, but Kevin Egar, who is a student of Matt Fouch's, has done a lot of work looking at receiver functions, and he looked for back-azimuthal variations in transverse receiver functions that might tell you about a large contrast in anisotropy at depth, and he really didn't find any compelling evidence for a single strong layer of anisotropy at one coherent depth, such as in the uppermost mantle. So I just want to talk a little bit about these potential mechanisms for spatial variations in DT. I'm going to talk first about the ones that I think are not very good explanations. You might think about possible spatial variations, say in crustal anisotropy or anisotropy in the shallow mantle lithosphere. The problem is that in almost every region of the world that people have looked, splitting due to crustal anisotropy is usually very small, on the order of 1/10 of a second. We think that the lithosphere beneath the HLP is very thin, but it's a little bit difficult to explain, a variation in splitting of a second or a second and a half, solely due to crustal anisotropy or frozen lithospheric anisotropy. You could think about variations in the thickness of the anisotropic layer beneath the HLP, but you'd have to have very dramatic variations in this thickness over very short length scales, and an explanation for these variations is a little bit difficult to come up with. You could think, well, maybe you have variations in the amount of strain in the asthenosphere, and you're just seeing kind of stronger deformation in some regions than in others. The problem with this explanation is that in lab experiments, Olivine LPO tends to saturate at fairly low strains of maybe 100 to 150%. From the geodynamical modeling, we think that strains beneath the HLP are probably fairly high. And again, it's somewhat difficult to get variations on such short length scales. So now I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about the 3 mechanisms that I think are maybe more plausible to explain these variations. We're going to look at variations in the strength of Olivine LPO, perhaps due to variations in temperature or volatile content. Variations perhaps in the olivine fabric type, so A-type versus C-type versus E-type olivine fabric, and then also variations in melt fraction if there's a shape-preferred orientation effect that's contributing to the anisotropy. So first, let's think about melt SPO. So this is, if there's a small amount of partial melt in the upper mantle that's aligned by the flow field, it can give you a shape-preferred orientation effect. So how plausible is this as a possible mechanism? Well, in a way, it's very plausible. I mean, we know that there's, there has been very recent volcanic activity. This is a picture from the Oregon BLM website of Coffee Pot Crater, which is in the Jordan Craters volcanic field. This is a basalt flow that may be as young as about 1,000 years old, so it's basically contemporary. So there, because we see very recent volcanic activity, there's likely to be some partial melt in the uppermost mantle. And there's evidence from petrology, this is work by Christy Till and Tim Grove and others, that these melts did equilibrate, at very shallow and fairly hot, shallow conditions and fairly hot temperatures. It's been shown through modeling that melt SPO can produce very strong anisotropy with large delay times. And given the very low S-wave velocities beneath the HLP that we see in surface wave models, this could be consistent with partial melt. The problem, though, is that if there is partial melt that's contributing a shape-preferred orientation effect, that should really be an effect that's, pretty confined likely to the very uppermost mantle where these melts are kind of equilibrating. We don't see an enhanced signal of this azimuthal anisotropy in either of the depth-dependent models that I showed a couple of slides ago. We also don't see evidence for a sharp contrast in anisotropic properties in the receiver functions. Another problem is that if you think of the Yellowstone Snake River Plain off to the east, that's experienced lots of recent volcanic activity too, and probably about 10 times the volumetric production as we've seen in the HLP. So if melt SPO is the explanation for the large delay times in the high lava plains, why don't we see it beneath the Snake River Plain trend as well? So those are kind of some problems with the melt model. Another idea is that, well, maybe these variations in delay times are actually reflecting differences in olivine LPO, and one possibility that we're actually seeing differences in the olivine fabric type. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly, what each of these fabric types mean, but C, E, and A-type olivine fabric will all give you that, same relationship between flow and fast direction that I talked about earlier in the talk. But there are some differences in the expected strength of anisotropy with each of these different fabric types. So one idea is that if you have differences in the conditions of deformation, maybe differences in water content due to different degrees of melting and volatile extraction, that maybe we're seeing transitions in the actual olivine fabric type. I think this is an interesting, kind of intriguing possibility. It's a little bit hard to kind of quantitatively evaluate this hypothesis. It's not very well known exactly how, the deformation conditions, particularly at different temperatures from an experimental standpoint, how exactly these different fabric types correspond to deformation conditions. And these fabric boundaries are imperfectly mapped out, particularly at lower temperatures, although the high temperature might be fairly relevant for the high lava plains. So I think it's an intriguing possibility, but it's a little bit difficult to sort of quantitatively evaluate the hypothesis. Another idea related to differences in olivine fabric might be that we're actually seeing variations in olivine LPO strength. I mean, again, this flow field is very simple, so there has to be something else that's giving us these variations in delay times. Maybe we're just looking at differences in the strength of olivine LPO. These are just a couple of figures from mineral physics papers that illustrate that if you look at olivine LPO in natural rocks, there's a pretty big variation in the strength of anisotropy. These are just two natural peridotites that have measured S-wave velocity anisotropy that's fairly different. It's 10% in one sample and more like 7% in another sample. This is from a review paper by David Mainprice. And then if you look at the Ben Ismail and Mainprice fabric database, this is just a plot of fabric strength, so the J index versus the S-wave anisotropy. I just want you to notice that there's a pretty big range from about 3 or 4% up to 16 or 17% in S-wave anisotropy in natural peridotite. So there's a very large range in fabric strength in natural rocks. So I think this idea is plausible. The problem is that we don't know very much at all. There's been very little laboratory work done looking at how deformation conditions, such as the temperature or the stress or the water content, actually affect the strength of LPO. So again, I think this is a really intriguing idea, but it's a little bit difficult. I think we don't quite have the constraints on the mineral physics side to evaluate, whether different conditions might be giving us different strength in LPO. But it's worth keeping in mind that there's a huge variation in LPO strength in natural rocks, and I think this is certainly a plausible explanation. So I'm going to wrap that up here just to kind of hit the high points, kind of the takeaway points that I'd like you to take away from this. We see very strong SKS splitting in the HLP region, generally east-west fast directions, and this very intriguing spatial variation in delay time. I think the data really require well-organized contemporary east-west mantle flow in the asthenosphere, and the detailed comparison with Kelsey's laboratory models have shown that models that have slab rollback do a very good job of matching the observations. The anisotropy data don't require the presence of a plume. I wouldn't say they rule out the presence of a plume either, but if plume material is present, it's certainly not driving the mantle flow. And finally, these spatial variations in delay times, I think are probably, I think they're telling us something, potentially really intriguing about what's going on in the mantle, whether or not we're seeing variations in partial melt or variations in temperature or water content or something that's actually affecting olivine deformation. And I think that, potentially with, new constraints on sort of the mineral physics end, this could actually help us tease apart some interesting questions about what controls the strength of anisotropy in the upper mantle, which is something that we don't know very well. So I'm going to stop there, and thanks very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to questions if we can figure out how to get that going.
So either if anybody has any questions, I think if you have on your panel, raise your hand or put something in the chat box, and I will unmute you.
I love how Pearl has the power to unmute people.
Yeah, and please identify yourself too when you ask the question.
I'm taking this as a sign that everything was perfectly clear.
This is Bob Busby. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'd like to at least thank Maureen Long for doing this presentation. It's very difficult when you're the speaker actually to get the feedback and get the confidence as you're doing this when you're sort of listening to a void. And I want to thank her for the very interesting talk, and the details of these S-wave splitting I think is pretty well illuminated in this particular talk. I had a quick question about whether you thought the partial melt theory might be illuminated further by incorporating some MT results, which may have been over this region as well. Does that help constrain that hypothesis a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that there are two things that I can think of that might immediately shed some light on whether or not the partial melt hypothesis is viable. One is, as you mentioned, non-seismic constraints, so particularly from MT, looking at conductivity can, really shed some light on things like the presence of partial melt. So that's definitely something to look at. And then from the seismic standpoint and from the standpoint of shear wave splitting, kind of next on the list to do with this data set is to look for frequency-dependent shear wave splitting, which is, can be very characteristic when you have SPO due to partial melt. That should give you a strong frequency-dependent signal. So far, from what I've looked at, I haven't seen a strong frequency dependence, but that's something that I'm working on looking at in more detail with this data set. So I definitely think there are a few other things that we can look at to try to figure out, whether partial melt SPO is contributing to anisotropy in this region.
And what range of frequencies would that be, from like a few hertz down to
yeah, well, these are pretty low frequency measurements. So the characteristic period for SKS tends to be around 8 or 10 seconds. Oftentimes there is some higher frequency energy, but it's, maybe periods of 1 to 5 seconds or so. So these are pretty low frequency measurements. But, when you have arrivals that have, strong amplitudes over several different frequency bands, you can kind of do a series of bandpass filters and look at splitting to see if there's any frequency dependence. But they're fairly low frequency measurements.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't see any questions.
It's sometimes difficult to get the microphone working on your computer in conjunction with this.
Okay.
Webinar thing. So oftentimes the chat might be the best way to forward a question. If you can
right. I do have a question right now. Vera, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Vera.
Okay. Hey, Maureen. I think I'm
Hi, Vera.
Hey. Thanks for a very nice talk. I think you were working on a sort of a finite frequency shear wave splitting tomography approach.
Yes.
Right? Did you try that here, and does that give you any more insight in that DT as well as fast direction variation?
It is being implemented almost as we speak. Yes, that's. This is. I have been working. I mean, starting it's part of my thesis research on kind of a theoretical framework to do finite frequency SKS tomography. And it turns out that it's very difficult to find data sets that have good enough coverage and particularly high enough station density where you can actually illuminate large parts of the upper mantle only using SKS phases. But this is one of them. So this, if you want to do SKS splitting tomography with teleseismic arrivals using this finite frequency framework, this is exactly the data set to do it. So I'm working on it, and I'm very optimistic that it's going to help get us those depth constraints that you really can't get just by looking at SKS splitting in an array theoretical point of view.
Great. Looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll keep you posted.
All right.
Any other questions? All right, well, maybe we'll thank Maureen since it's just, I guess, 2 o'clock Eastern now. That was a great talk. Thanks very much for agreeing to do this and being the first person to
Not at all. Thank you very much for your
It
invitation.
seemed to work quite well.
Yes.
And if there's feedback on this method, let's post that to the TA working group email list. I think it's pretty successful.
And I have attempted to record this. I will have to check to see whether or not that actually worked. And so if that has worked, we'll let everybody know where it's posted.
Okay. All right. I think that's it.
All right. Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording and end the webinar now. Thank you.